The strange thing about power is that it can open every door in Manhattan except the one that matters when you're alone. At 10:47 on New Year's Eve, Vivian Sterling stepped out of a black town car on West 57th Street wearing a charcoal wool coat that cost more than most people's rent. And for the first time in years, she had come without an assistant, without security, without the polished little machine that usually moved ahead of her and made the world say yes before she even arrived. She wanted one ordinary night, one table, one glass of champagne she didn't have to share with investors, board members, or men who measured her smile like it was market data. The rooftop restaurant above her was wrapped in gold light and winter music, every window glowing with people who already belonged to someone. Couples leaned close over candlelight. Children pressed sugar-dusted fingers to the glass. A man in a navy peacoat was helping his wife with her scarf while their teenage son pretended not to notice. Vivian stood there for half a second longer than she should have, watching that small scene like it was something expensive she could admire but never own. Inside, the hostess checked the reservation list twice, recognized her on the third glance, and still gave the same apologetic smile. Completely booked. Fire code at capacity. No standing room at the bar. Vivian could have bought the building before midnight if she wanted to. She could have had the owner on the phone in 60 seconds. But tonight, for reasons she didn't fully understand, the humiliation of asking for special treatment felt worse than the rejection itself. So she thanked the hostess, turned toward the elevator, and told herself it was ridiculous that a woman who ran a billion-dollar company could feel 16 years old just because there was nowhere to sit. That was when a chair scraped softly across hardwood. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to interrupt the story she was already telling herself. Near the far side of the room, at a small table by the window, a man had risen to his feet. He looked like the kind of father no one noticed until they needed one. Dark jacket, worn boots, tired eyes, steady hands. Beside him sat a little girl in a red cardigan with a paper crown slipping over one eyebrow, and a cup of melted vanilla ice cream she had stopped eating so she could stare openly at Vivian. The man gave a simple wave toward the empty chair at his table. No smirk, no recognition, no performance, just a quiet invitation. And before Vivian could decide whether that was kindness or the beginning of a mistake, the little girl leaned toward him and whispered, in a voice somehow small and clear enough to cross the whole room, "Dad, she looks like she forgot where home is." For one long second, Vivian Sterling just stood there with one hand still wrapped around the strap of her handbag, as if the wrong movement might turn the whole scene cheap. Men had invited her to tables before. Men had made room for her before. But there was always a reason attached to it, something polished and hungry behind the smile. A business card, a favor, a story to tell later. This felt different, and that was exactly why she did not trust it. The little girl was still watching her with the kind of honest curiosity adults spent years learning how to bury, and the man beside her did not repeat the gesture. He simply waited, calm in a way that made the noise of the room seem louder around him. Vivian had built an empire by reading people fast. She knew when someone wanted access, when someone wanted leverage, and when someone thought a powerful woman alone on a holiday was an opportunity wearing heels. But this man only stood there with his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, like offering shelter from the cold was the most ordinary thing in the world. So she crossed the room before she could talk herself out of it. "Thank you," she said, setting down her coat with careful precision. "You do not have to do this." "I know," the man said. His voice was low, even, almost quiet enough to disappear beneath the piano near the bar. But no one should be standing alone 10 minutes before midnight. There it was again, that strange lack of performance. No recognition. No stumble over her name. No flicker that said he knew exactly who she was. Vivian sat, and the little girl smiled like something had gone right in the universe. "I am Sadie," she announced. "This is my dad, Owen. He makes the best grilled cheese in New York, but he burns pancakes when he is distracted." Owen gave a small breath of a laugh and slid a fresh water glass toward Vivian. "You do not have to believe all of her advertising. It is not advertising if it is true," Sadie said. Vivian surprised herself by smiling back. "Then I will keep that in mind." Up close, Owen Parker looked even less like the kind of man who belonged in her world. His dark jacket had seen more than one winter. His watch was practical, not expensive. His hands were clean but rough at the knuckles, the hands of someone who actually carried groceries, fixed loose screws, tied shoelaces, and did not outsource the small burdens of living. But there was something else there too, something she noticed only when a server passed too close to Sadie's chair. Owen shifted his arm before the tray, ever tilted, subtle and exact, blocking the space without making it obvious. A few minutes later, a burst of laughter rose too sharply from the bar, and Sadie's shoulders tightened for half a second. Owen rested 2 fingers against the edge of the table and tapped a soft rhythm near her plate. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for his daughter to breathe normally again. Vivian watched both moments and felt a tiny, unwelcome prickle at the base of her neck. That was not random fatherly instinct. That was practice timing. Sadie picked up a red crayon from a small paper packet and began drawing on the back of a kid's menu. "What are you making?" Vivian asked. "A map," Sadie said. "Of lonely people." Vivian gave a faint laugh. "And how many have you found?" Sadie looked up at her, as if the answer should have been obvious. 3. The server arrived with fresh bread, sparkling water, and the kind of smile trained to make expensive places feel effortless, but Vivian Sterling noticed the strain under it right away. The young man set down a basket near Sadie, nearly clipped the edge of a candle, then corrected himself too fast, as if he had already been scolded once. "Tonight, are you all set here?" he asked. Owen gave a polite nod, but his eyes flicked past the server's shoulder toward the swing door leading to the service hall. Not long, not dramatic, just one glance. Vivian followed it on instinct and saw nothing except polished brass, warm light, and a hostess laughing too brightly at something a manager had said. When she looked back, Owen was tearing a piece of bread into smaller bites for Sadie, like the moment had never happened. "So," Vivian said, folding her hands in front of her, "do you always invite strangers to join your table on major holidays?" Sadie answered before her father could. "Only the ones who look like they need it." Owen tipped his head, half apology, half surrender. "She thinks she is very subtle." "I am subtle," Sadie said. "You are just old." Vivian let out a real laugh that surprised all 3 of them. It changed the air at the table. For the first time that night, she did not feel like she was performing herself. Owen asked her simple questions, but not the usual ones. Not "what do you do?" Not "where do you live?" Not the tidy categories people used when they wanted to place someone quickly. He asked if she liked New Year's Eve or only tolerated it. He asked whether she had always preferred city winters over quiet ones. He asked if she thought people changed at midnight or just promised to. The questions were disarming because they were human, and because she had not realized how long it had been since anyone had asked her something that could not be turned into a headline. She gave careful answers at first, then less careful ones. She admitted she had once loved holidays before they began to feel like board meetings with glitter. She admitted she had not planned to come here alone, but at the last minute decided she was tired of being managed by her own calendar. Sadie listened like these were clues in a treasure hunt, coloring circles and arrows across the back of the menu. "This one is you," she said, sliding the paper toward Vivian. It showed a tall stick figure standing near a square that might have been a window. "Why am I all the way over there?" Vivian asked. Sadie shrugged. "Because lonely people make themselves smaller, even when they are standing in a big room." The child said it so plainly that Vivian almost forgot to breathe. Owen looked at his daughter, then at Vivian, and there was no embarrassment in his face, only a quiet awareness that some truths arrived better in crayons than in adult language. A burst of laughter rose from a table behind them, followed by the sharp pop of a champagne bottle. Sadie's fingers froze around her crayon for half a second. Owen reached for his water glass, tapped the side twice with one fingernail, then once against the table, a pattern so subtle Vivian might have missed it if she had not already been watching him too closely. Sadie exhaled and relaxed. "You do that every time?" Vivian asked softly. Owen glanced down at his daughter. "Sometimes the room gets too loud before the music does." It was a simple answer, but again there was that feeling that she was seeing the edge of something deeper. Then a faint smell threaded through the warm air. Not enough for anyone else to react. Just a thin, bitter trace, like something electrical had been working too hard for too long. Owen's head lifted almost imperceptibly. He looked toward the service hall again, this time holding the glance one beat longer. "Excuse me," he said, already rising. "Sadie, stay with Miss Sterling for 1 minute." Vivian looked up at him. "Is something wrong?" Owen slid his chair back with the same calm he used for everything else, but now she could see it clearly. Calm was not his personality. Calm was his training. Maybe nothing, he said. I just want to check if the room agrees with itself. For the first time since she had sat down, Vivian Sterling was alone with Sadie Parker, and the silence between them did not feel awkward. It felt observant. The little girl kept coloring on the back of the menu, her small hand moving with total confidence, as if lonely people and crowded rooms were things she had already studied enough to map. Vivian glanced toward the service hall where Owen had disappeared. Does your father always do that? She asked. Sadie did not look up right away. Do what? Notice things before everyone else. That made Sadie pause. She switched crayons, choosing blue this time, then drew a box with 3 tiny arrows pointing away from it. He says rooms talk, she said. Most people just do not listen until they are yelling. Vivian leaned back slightly and studied the child with new attention. There was nothing rehearsed in Sadie's voice. No sense that she was repeating a cute family line. She was saying something she believed because she had watched it prove itself. Across the room, a waiter brushed past a chair too quickly, and someone near the windows laughed louder than the music for a second. Sadie's shoulders twitched at the sound, then settled again when she pressed both palms flat on the table like she was grounding herself. Vivian noticed that too. You and your father come here often? She asked. No, Sadie said. This place is too shiny. Vivian smiled despite herself. Then why tonight? Because my dad promised I could see the ball drop from high up at least once before I turned 10. She looked up, serious now. He keeps his promises. Something about the way she said it made Vivian think that sentence was heavier in their house than it sounded. She looked again toward the service hall, and when Owen returned, he was not carrying napkins or a forgotten coat or any ordinary excuse that would explain why he had been gone. He simply sat down, calm as before, though there was a sharpened edge to his focus now. Everything all right? Vivian asked. Probably, he said, but his eyes moved once toward the far corridor where the emergency exit sign glowed above a narrow door. The east service latch looks sticky, and one of the lights near the hall is blinking off rhythm. Vivian stared at him. You noticed that in less than a minute? It is easier when people are trying not to notice it, Owen said. He reached for Sadie's spoon and straightened it beside her plate because it had been turned the wrong way for her left hand. Again, that quiet precision. Again, that feeling that every movement had a reason behind it. Vivian folded one leg over the other and studied him without apology now. You talk like a man who has inspected more than restaurants. Owen met her gaze for a moment, and something unreadable passed through his face before it settled again. I have spent enough time in crowded places to know the difference between inconvenience and the first sign of trouble. It was not a full answer, and they both knew it. Vivian had made a career out of hearing what people left out. Her first instinct was to press harder, identify the gap, sort him into some category that made sense. Former military, perhaps. Emergency management. Private security. A man who had once worked close enough to danger that he now carried it with him in quieter forms. But before she could decide which guess fit best, a manager in a black suit passed near their table and gave Owen the tight smile people used when they wanted someone polite to stop asking inconvenient questions. Sir, our staff has already checked the corridor, the manager said lightly. Everything is under control. Owen did not rise to the tone. Then have someone check the east latch again, he said. And the exit light near the service hall. It is cycling irregularly. The manager's smile thinned at the corners. Thank you. We have it handled. He moved on before Vivian could speak, but she felt something shift anyway. Not in the room. In herself. Because she had heard that tone before. She had used it before. It was the voice of polished authority telling reality to wait its turn. Owen picked up his water glass, and Sadie went back to coloring as if none of it mattered. But then the child spoke without looking up. He should have listened. Vivian looked at her. Why do you say that? Sadie drew one final arrow on the paper and answered in a voice so small it almost disappeared under the music. Because when my dad gets quiet like this, it means the room is already late. The manager's polished smile stayed in the air for a second after he walked away, and Vivian Sterling felt something cold and familiar settle under her ribs. She knew that smile. She had built rooms full of it. It was the expression people used when they wanted the appearance of control more than the burden of truth. Owen did not say another word right away. He simply turned towards Sadie and adjusted the paper crown that had slipped too far over her eyebrow. "How is the map coming?" he asked. Sadie looked down at her drawing. "Worse," she said. "There are more arrows now." Owen nodded like that answer made perfect sense. Vivian watched him, trying to fit him into some pattern she understood. Men like him were supposed to fill the silence with explanations. They were supposed to mention former jobs, old credentials, some convenient little resume that justified why they noticed doors and lights and the movement of crowded rooms. But Owen Parker just broke a dinner roll in half and placed a larger piece on Sadie's bread plate without looking at his own. That small act unsettled her more than any speech would have. He was not trying to be impressive. He was just being exactly what he was, and that was harder to read. A server returned to refill their glasses, and this time Vivian noticed the young woman's hands were trembling. Not dramatically, just enough for one drop of sparkling water to miss the rim and bead on the tablecloth. Owen handed her a napkin before she could apologize. "Has the kitchen been running hot all evening?" he asked in the same tone another customer might use to ask about the dessert menu. The server froze. Her eyes flicked once toward the service hall, then toward the manager near the hostess stand. "I do not know, sir," she said too quickly. "Everything should be fine." Should be. Not is. Vivian heard it instantly. So did Owen. The server moved away, shoulders tight. Vivian lowered her voice. "You are making the staff nervous." "No," Owen said, still watching the service corridor. "Something else is making the staff nervous." Then he looked at her for the first time with no softness around the edges. "How many locations do you operate that use centralized remote monitoring for hospitality properties?" The question hit her like a hand on a locked door. Vivian kept her expression still. "That is a strange thing to ask at dinner." "Maybe," Owen said. "But it becomes less strange when a manager trusts a dashboard more than the smell in his own building." Sadie had gone quiet again, not scared, just listening with the serious stillness children sometimes had when adults were circling something important. Vivian glanced toward the far wall where a sleek black control panel was mounted near the hostess station. Part of her wanted to dismiss him. She had spent years helping design systems that removed human error, streamlined staffing, flagged risk in real time, and gave executives like her the confidence to scale faster than instinct ever could. But another part of her remembered the exact phrase from a boardroom 2 years earlier. "If the data says stable, we cannot afford to react to every nervous employee with a bad feeling." She had signed off on that approach. She had praised its efficiency. And now, standing just outside that memory, was a quiet single father who had smelled trouble through candlelight and music before anyone else in the room would admit it existed. "I know that look," Owen said softly. "You have seen this kind of system before." Vivian did not answer, and that was answer enough. At the edge of the room, the manager was suddenly speaking in a low, urgent voice to a young technician holding a tablet. The technician shook his head once, then lowered it when the manager stepped closer. Vivian saw the motion, saw the obedience, saw the fear under it, and for the first time that night, the room no longer felt elegant to her. It felt arranged, curated, balanced on something no one wanted named. Then Sadie put down her crayon and looked straight at Vivian. "When grown-ups know a thing is wrong," she asked quietly, "why do they always wait until it gets louder?" For a moment, nobody moved. The music kept playing. Glasses kept clinking. Somewhere near the windows, a couple laughed too loudly over a phone held up for a picture, and the whole room still looked like New Year's Eve was exactly what it was supposed to be. But Vivian Sterling could feel the shape of the question Sadie had asked settling into everything around her. Why do grown-ups wait until it gets louder? She had no answer that did not sound like guilt-wearing business language. Owen reached for his water glass, but he did not drink from it. He was listening again, not to the band, not to the room, but to the thin layer underneath both. Then the lights above the service corridor blinked once. Just once. Most people would not have noticed. Vivian did. So did Owen. Their eyes met for half a second, and what passed between them was not fear. It was recognition. The room had just admitted he was right. A busser hurried through the corridor carrying folded linens, and when the door swung open, that same bitter electrical smell slipped into the dining room, stronger now, sharp enough to cut through rosemary, butter, and champagne. Owen was already on his feet. "Sadie," he said, and his voice changed in a way Vivian felt before she understood it. It did not get louder. It got cleaner. "Coat on. Stay close to Miss Sterling." Sadie did not argue. She moved instantly, as if this tone belonged to rules they had practiced before. Vivian stood too, more from instinct than decision. "What are you doing?" she asked. Owen was watching the far wall, the exits, the narrow gap between tables, the cluster of servers near the bar, every angle at once. "I am deciding whether this stays inconvenient or becomes a problem," he said. He stepped toward the hostess' stand just as the manager turned, ready with that same polished expression, but Owen cut through it before the man could speak. "Open the east service door now," he said, "and lower the music." The manager gave a short, offended laugh. "Sir, we are not disrupting the entire room because of a smell." "Then do it because your exit light is cycling wrong, your staff is already spooked, and your kitchen runner just came through a corridor that smells like heated wiring." Owen's tone never sharpened, but it carried anyway. Not dramatic, not angry, just undeniable. A few nearby guests began to look over. The manager's face tightened. "We have procedures in place." "Then use them," Owen said. Vivian saw it then, finally in full. This was not a nervous father overreacting in a crowded room. This was a man who had spent enough years standing one bad minute ahead of everyone else that his calm no longer belonged to ordinary life. The manager hesitated, caught between embarrassment and denial, and made the worst possible choice. He turned toward the young technician with the tablet and snapped. "Check the monitor again." Not the door, not the corridor, the monitor. Vivian felt something almost physical go through her, because that sentence had come straight out of the world she knew. Trust the screen. Delay the disruption. Protect the appearance of control. Owen looked at her only once. "You can still stop this from becoming public panic," he said quietly, "but not by pretending it is nothing." Before Vivian could answer, the lights dimmed a second time, longer now, just enough to pull a ripple of unease through the room. A few voices rose. A champagne flute tipped and rolled across a nearby tablecloth. Sadie stepped closer to Vivian and slipped one small hand into hers. Then, from the service hall, a staff member's voice broke through the music in a sharp burst of alarm, and the entire rooftop changed shape in a single breath. The sharp voice from the service hall did not become panic right away, but it changed the room in the way a crack changes glass. People were still standing beside their tables, still holding phones and half-finished conversations, but now their eyes were searching for confirmation from someone else before deciding what to feel. That was the dangerous moment, Owen knew. Not the first sign of trouble. The second after it, when uncertainty began moving faster than reason. He stepped forward without hesitation. "Lower the music," he said again, this time not to the manager, but to the nearest server frozen beside the sound console. The young woman obeyed before she even seemed to realize she had made a choice. The piano track dropped out. Voices rushed in to fill the space. Owen turned toward the center of the room, scanning the tables, the corridor, the narrow run between the bar and the windows. "Everyone stay where you are for a moment," he said, calm and clear enough to carry without sounding like alarm. "We need space before we need speed." The phrasing was strange, but it worked. People paused. That pause bought him the room. Vivian Sterling stood with Sadie's small hand folded tightly in hers and watched him become someone she had not met at dinner. The softness did not leave him. The father did not disappear. But another layer rose underneath it, something measured, practiced, and impossible to fake. He pointed once toward the east side. "Do not move toward the narrow corridor. Use the main aisle. Keep children near adults. Leave your coats if you have to." A man near the bar opened his mouth to protest, and Owen crossed the distance with 3 quick steps, not confrontational, just present in a way that shut argument down before it started. Then a maintenance worker pushed through the service door, saw Owen, and stopped cold. His face changed with recognition. "Captain Parker?" he said before he could stop himself. Vivian felt the name land in her chest. Owen did not react, except for the smallest tightening in his jaw. For 1 second, the room seemed to split in two. In one half stood the man who had shared bread with his daughter and made room for a stranger. In the other stood someone who had once carried authority so naturally that people still reached for it under pressure. Sadie heard it too. Vivian felt the little girl go still beside her. "Dad?" Sadie whispered, and that one word held more fear than the room itself. Owen looked back at her, and for the first time all night, the calm in his face showed strain around the edges. "Stay with Miss Sterling," he said gently. I need you to do exactly what we practiced. Eyes on me until I tell you otherwise. Sadie's chin trembled once, but she nodded. Vivian looked from the child to the man everyone was suddenly following and understood the shape of the hidden wound before she knew the details. This was not just a past he had left behind. It was a version of himself his daughter had been promised she would not have to meet again. Another light flickered near the hall. A few guests shifted closer together, searching for direction. Owen was already moving, redirecting traffic with the quiet precision of someone who knew that crowds listened best to certainty. Vivian had spent years believing power came from command, scale, distance, control. But the most powerful thing in that room was a single father in a worn dark jacket who had stood up for her 20 minutes earlier with one simple wave, and who was now holding back chaos with nothing except his voice, his judgment, and a promise to a little girl that was clearly costing him more by the second. For a few suspended seconds, the rooftop held together on Owen Parker's voice alone. Guests were moving now, but not stampeding, because he had given them something more valuable than reassurance. He had given them sequence. Families first through the center aisle. No one toward the East Service corridor. Keep children low and close. Move around the corners of the room, not through the middle of uncertainty. Vivian Sterling stood exactly where he had left her, one hand around Sadie's small fingers, and watched the room obey a man who, half an hour earlier, had been invisible to everyone except his daughter. Then the manager made the mistake that split the night wide open. He stepped in front of the hostess stand and said, too loudly, "There is no emergency. Please remain calm." Owen turned so fast the motion barely looked human. "Do not say that unless you are ready to prove it," he said. It was still not a shout. That was what made it land. The manager faltered, and in that same instant the young technician with the tablet blurted out what fear had been trying to hide for 10 minutes. "The East latch is not releasing remotely." Vivian felt the words hit her like cold water. Not releasing remotely. Not failing by accident. Failing inside the exact kind of system she had helped normalize across high-end properties because investors loved efficiency more than redundancy. Owen did not waste a second on blame. "Then we do this without it," he said. He redirected a cluster of guests away from the narrow side passage and toward the main dining aisle, using empty chairs to widen the path and a linen stand to block the instinctive rush toward the wrong exit. The movement was so efficient it looked simple, which Vivian knew meant it was not. Sadie's grip tightened once around her hand. "He promised he was done," the little girl whispered, not taking her eyes off her father. Vivian looked down at her. "Done with what?" Sadie swallowed before answering. "With being the man everybody needs when something goes wrong." That was the real heartbreak. Not that Owen had once been important. Not that he had been trained for rooms like this. It was that his daughter had loved him hardest in the version of life where no one needed him that way anymore. And now the city, the restaurant, the bad systems, the polished liars, all of it was pulling that man back out in front of her. Another staff member hurried over, breathless, and stared at Owen with open recognition. "Captain, the corridor by the prep station is heating up." Again with the title. Again with the truth trying to surface in fragments. Vivian saw Owen close his eyes for one fraction of a second, as if the name itself cost him something. Then he opened them and became practical again. "Move your people away from that wall. Open the loading access by the north stair. And somebody kill the decorative gas line at the bar." He gave instructions like a man remembering an old language his body still spoke more fluently than grief. Vivian understood then that she was standing at the center of two failures at once. One was corporate, and it belonged partly to her. The other was deeply personal, and she was witnessing it in a little girl's face. She looked toward the manager, toward the technician, toward the frightened staff still waiting for permission to do the obvious thing, and something in her went very still. All evening she had been measuring Owen Parker as a question. Now she understood the more dangerous truth. He was not the question. She was. Because at some point in her life, she had become the kind of person who would have protected the appearance of control until a better man forced her to choose between optics and reality. Owen was already buying the room time. What happened next would decide whether she deserved to stay at his table at all. By the time the rooftop finally began to empty, midnight had already passed, but nobody in the room seemed to care about the countdown anymore. The city was still exploding in gold beyond the glass, but inside, People moved with the stunned quiet of those who had just come too close to a version of the night they had not been invited to imagine. Owen Parker stood near the center aisle until the last family cleared the main exit, one hand lifted to guide, one eye always finding Sadie, even when he was looking somewhere else. He never once raised his voice. He never once made the moment about himself. And somehow that made everything about him harder to ignore. Vivian Sterling stayed with Sadie because that was where Owen had placed her, and for the first time in a very long time, she followed someone else's judgment without trying to improve it. When the final cluster of guests disappeared toward the stairwell, and the room settled into the strange after-silence that follows fear, Owen exhaled like a man setting down a weight he had promised his daughter he would never pick up again. Sadie let go of Vivian's hand and walked toward him slowly. Not running, not smiling, just looking up at him with eyes far too old for a child in a paper crown. "You said you were done," she whispered. Owen knelt in front of her, his face gentler now, but more tired than before. "I know," he said. It was the kind of answer that meant there were years behind it. Vivian looked away for a second because the intimacy of that small heartbreak felt almost private, and because she was standing in the wreckage of her own choices too. The technician's words were still in her head, not releasing remotely. A failure inside a system she had approved. A room that had trusted screens more than instincts because people like her had taught them to. She could already see the shape of what would happen next. Lawyers, insurance teams, public statements carefully shaved down to the safest possible truth. A board that would call the night unfortunate and isolated and manageable. Unless she refused. Unless, for once, she chose damage over dishonesty. Owen rose to his feet and finally looked at her the way he had not all evening. Not as a lonely woman at a restaurant. Not as a stranger sharing bread with his daughter, but as the person standing at the center of what came next. Vivian expected blame. He did not give it to her. Somehow that was worse. "They will ask you to make this smaller than it was," he said quietly. "That is what people do when the truth threatens expensive things." Vivian held his gaze. "And what do people like you do?" A tired half-smile touched his mouth, but it did not reach his eyes. "We count exits before speeches." Before she could answer, Sadie stepped between them, still holding the crumpled menu where she had drawn her map of lonely people. She looked from her father to Vivian and then back again, like she was deciding whether adults ever deserved the second chances they kept wanting from children. Then she held the paper out to Vivian. The map had changed. The three lonely figures were still there, but now Sadie had drawn a fourth shape near the edge of the page, larger than the others, with arrows pointing in every direction. "Who is that?" Vivian asked softly. Sadie tilted her head. "I have not decided yet." Outside, sirens moved somewhere far below, and inside, the manager was already speaking in a low voice to someone from legal. Owen heard it too. Vivian saw his shoulders tighten, just once. If this story went public, the world would learn who he had been. If it stayed buried, the world would never learn what it had almost cost. Sadie reached for her father's hand, but her eyes stayed on Vivian. "If she sits at our table next year," she asked, in that clear, impossible voice only children can have, "does she have to tell the truth before dessert?" Vivian did not answer. Owen did not answer either. Because maybe the real question was not whether a billionaire CEO deserved another seat at their table. Maybe it was whether a man who had hidden his old life to protect his daughter could survive what happened if the truth came looking for him again. And if you were Sadie, standing there between the woman whose system nearly failed the room and the father whose past had just stepped back into the light, who would you trust first?